Hello, you've downloaded a podcast of the Food Programme. Welcome to our world, from cooking to culture, politics to pleasure. We hope you enjoy it. As 2015 trudges damply to its close, we've been reflecting here at the Food Programme on the piles of books showered on us by publishers this year. Some that out in shopping land have sold like hotcakes, some not. So has virtue, quality, imagination and good writing been rewarded? And what does this sheer quantity of books about food tell us about what, how and why we cook, and about our relationship with food? We'll see. We'll be talking about a new food Bible and its 31-year-old author, a book so epic in its ambition that it doubled in size during its creation.
It was only predicted to be half the amount of words, 150,000, and it ended up being 260,000 because it was just so much that we couldn't leave out.
And joining me today are three people who are all experts and enthusiasts in the art and mystery of food writing and publishing. Food writer and journalist Alex Renton, B. Wilson, author of Consider the Fork, and the about-to-be-published First Bite, How We Learn to Eat. And Tom Tivenan, features editor at the trade magazine The Bookseller, who in another life was a restaurant reviewer in Scotland. All of you, what makes a cookbook truly interesting and valuable, Alex?
The proof is in the reading, isn't it? If it excites me, if it takes me somewhere that Google can't take me, and if it sends me running to the stove, ultimately, that's a good cookbook.
B.
Well, none of us needs another recipe. We have thousands of them on our shelves already. But for me, it's something that keeps me company in the kitchen and somehow makes me yearn to turn the pages so much that I feel that, yes, I do need all of these extra recipes in my life, and I am going to cook them one day, if not now.
Tom.
I must say I'm attracted to the design. This perhaps shows how shallow I am, but I often find myself leafing through my most beautiful cookbooks, the one that feel good to the hands, and then go back to my old originals.
To cook.
To cook, yes.
Tom, I mean, you look at the publishing world in its entirety, and looking at cookbook publishing, how would you summarise 2015?
Well, first of all, it's been a great year for Britain. Sales are up for cookery books about 10-11% year on year. Very good. And that's been driven largely by the clean eating trend. Deliciously Ella is the biggest selling book of the year thus far. Of the top 10 books of the year so far, 8 are broadly in the clean eating trend.
It sounds so unpleasant. What is clean eating?
It is not eating dirty food, filthy food. It is books that are geared towards making yourself healthier, glowing. That's a key word for publishers. About 4 or 5 cookery books have the word glow in the title. It's about dropping weight. But also what these books claim is that they still have delicious recipes, even though they're healthy.
Well, this is a subject we'll come back to in a moment. Out of the 1,500 food titles that will appear in the UK by the year's end, and the nearly 13,000 published in the English language globally, some, as I said, have been runaway successes. Some have steadily sold by word of mouth, and some have disappeared. We asked some friends of the programme to tell us what in that great babble has interested them.
My name is Joanna Blythman, and I'm an investigative food writer. For me, one of the standout books of the year is Nigel Slater's third volume of the Kitchen Diaries, and it's called A Year of Good Eating. For me, Nigel is not a food celebrity. He's not a construction of publishers or marketing company. Nigel is Nigel. I always feel that there's two kinds of cookery books. There's ones that come and go and are completely unmemorable. And then there are ones that really stand the test of times because they have something in them, a quality, something that just makes you think, I do not want to part with this book. And it's uncanny how Nigel Slater manages to do this time and time again.
My name's Xanthi Clay. I'm a food writer for The Telegraph. Slippery Noodles by Xiang-Ju Lin. This is a culinary history of China, seen through the vector of food and cooking. I found it completely engrossing.
I'm Diana Henry. I'm a food writer. This year, my favourite book was 30 Ingredients by the chef Sally Clark. It's a collection of recipes based on 30 ingredients that she loves. It is a book where the design and the content are in perfect harmony. Her food is very unfussy. She's really our Alice Waters in the UK.
I'm Gillian Carter, editor of BBC Good Food magazine. I absolutely loved Rick Stein's From Venice to Istanbul. And I think what really excited me about it was food from the countries I really hadn't been. I felt Venice, maybe some familiarity, but Albania, for instance, who knew? And he did it beautifully, and the accompanying TV series was ravishing as well.
I was really interested this year by a book by Ben Richardson on sugar, simply called Sugar, which is really making a more profound and thoughtful contribution to the whole ongoing sugar debate.
I also really loved Annie Rigg's Summer Berries and Autumn Fruits. It's just glorious. She has a great palette and her recipes really work. And if you like fruit, you'll be putting post-it notes everywhere.
On Pasta by Anna Del Conte. This is a reprinting of the great Italian food writer's first cookery book, which she has also updated. And it's a history of pasta right from its early days. And she writes in a warm, friendly way that just makes me want to sit down and eat carbs.
Xanthi Clay, Gillian Carter, Joanna Blytheman and Diana Henry. B, what's interested you in 2015?
So much has interested me. I think this thing we've already mentioned about clean eating is interesting. I mean, it's astonishing statistically how many of the books have been on that subject. But also I'm seeing little signs of a backlash. Or rather, that the best books for me within that trend are ones which have injected a note of scepticism. One I would mention, I love this young food writer, Anna Jones, who last year brought out A Modern Way to Eat. This year she has A Modern Way to Cook. And somehow she manages to include recipes that include things like chia seeds or coconut flour without being intensely annoying. It's partly she never promises to make you glow or make you beautiful. And she always starts from the premise that what you want is flavour and something delicious. But the other one I wanted to mention is simply Nigella. It sounds from the title as if she's gone all deliciously Ella, but she begins with this rather wonderful polemic against clean eating. She writes, "The clean eating brigade seems an embodiment of all my fears. Food is not dirty. The pleasures of the flesh are essential to life, and however we eat, we are not guaranteed immortality or immunity from loss." And I think that just says it all. I mean, so within this book, you'll not only find recipes for avocado salads with pumpkin seeds, but you'll also find cakes and stews and any of the things that Nigella might have given us in her previous books. And to me, that's quite a subversive act. It's like saying, no, food isn't perfect, life isn't perfect, let's move on.
Yes, I mean, I'm very intrigued in the healthy eating, the eating clean and the free-from debate. And I mean, for me, I think that if you're going to write a health and diet book, you need at least a little grounding in the science of how the gut works. And most of the books that have gone into that area really have very little science at all behind them.
But, you know, at least they're paying attention to food. You know, they're taking food seriously. Isn't that possibly a good thing?
I mean, I think the clean eating trend definitely, it makes sense as a response to how profoundly dysfunctional our food supply has become. So to that extent, I sympathise with them, but they've swung from one extreme to another.
No, but I mean, the book that's really appealed to you, Alex, right in front of you, is this one by a scientist that's called The Diet Myth, The Real Science Behind What We Eat.
Yes, it's a great book, and for a scientist, a lovely, easy, urbane read too. Tim Spector, who's a genetic epidemiologist at King's College, is very interesting. And he had a possible stroke and high blood pressure, and he went about looking for a diet. And of course, being a scientist, he then applied his science, which is particularly the study of identical twins, which is very interesting because you really can prove whether things are happening or not. And he reaches some pretty harsh conclusions. And one of them, I'll just read this quickly, is that no other field of science or medicine sees such professional infighting, lack of consensus, and lack of rigorous studies to back up the health claims of the myriad dietary recommendations. And he concludes, really, that most of the issues that the healthy eating books we have in front of us are not issues primarily about diet, but about genetics. So they need to be addressed by looking specifically at people's individual digestions, not least the microbiome in their gut, not with blanket prescriptions like no gluten or less protein or whatever. And it's very convincing. I'd advise anyone pondering a diet during this season to read it first.
I mean, I've read it and I thought it completely fascinating, the centrality of the bugs in our system. But in fact, that's quite a difficult message to sell to someone, isn't it? I mean, isn't the answer, you know, don't eat junk food or eat
Yes, I think
small
that's
amounts of
absolutely
junk
right.
food.
But I think also you don't be waylaid by easy answers like gluten-free, where the science just isn't there to back it up, except for the 1 in 100 people who have celiac disease. Lots of respect for Ella Woodward, who used diet to conquer a terrible disease that she was suffering from. But she's now telling people that gluten, an element of the most important food crop on the planet, is a contaminant. And I think it's a worry for when people come into the great world of cooking thinking that these things are bad for everybody, when in fact they're just bad for maybe 1 in 100 people.
Although I have various people that I know, and indeed in my family, that have food intolerances, and that makes you look at the whole thing in a completely different light. There is a simple message in this groundbreaking book. It's eat a variety of foods and then you'll end up with variety in your microbes.
Yes.
And that even if we're all starting from a different genetic point, that's going to do everyone some good.
Yes, and it is a book, he does support my thesis, which is eat for pleasure, eat widely for pleasure, and that book shows you that the science
I
does
think he
back
missed
that.
a bit with psychology. He doesn't really look at why we eat particular diets, why we're driven to particular foods. I would have liked a bit more of what's going on in the head. So a book I've really loved this year, for me, the standout debut of the year is by this young Ukrainian writer called Olya Hercules, and it's called Mamushka. And it's just such a wonderful combination of travel and recipes and reminiscences. And every year there'll be beautiful books about food and travel, but sometimes they're a little bit manicured, whereas this one has really honest reminiscences about people cooking sweet garlicky chicken in tower blocks, or how they could only afford margarine most of the time when she was a child in the USSR, so that's what she sometimes still bakes with. And the recipes are just sublime, the ones I've tried so far. Yogurt pancakes, roasted cabbage. I would never have thought to roast a cabbage before.
I mean, Alex, you've looked at that book. What did you think?
I think it's an absolutely lovely book, and it looks beautiful. And as you say, she gives you history and personal anecdote and so on, which just adds all the extra flavour you need. I love a dish called Soviet goose noodles, which is essentially where you boil a goose to bits and you serve it on pasta. And she calls it a love child of the user's far-flung bribery and autarkic shortcomings, pointing out that in that era you had to make your own noodles because the Soviet ones were so awful. And a goose was the sort of thing that her surgeon uncle used often to get as a bribe in order to help people. And it's a lovely book that inspires you. It really does.
Given how much Ukraine has been in the news this year, that it undercuts that to remind us, what a rich and diverse and exotic food culture there is there, that it borders on Turkey, that it has extraordinary things grow there. It isn't all babushkas trudging through the snow in headscarves.
Yes, and it's a book of heroism as well. Like you feel very, in wonder at how some of the recipes and ideas have survived those years of shortages, and it does remind you that all food is about politics, and it's a very political book.
I mean, she talks about the food that she ate during the shortages, things like sitting around during a power cut, they would fry up sunflower seeds and just sit crunching them, popping them with their teeth. And somehow nothing is ever going to taste quite as special as that in the affluent West. She's not wanting to go back, but there is a wonderful strain of nostalgia.
Tom, what do you make of what Bea and Alex have chosen as their books of the year?
Well, it's interesting. With Mamushka, it's part of a growing trend, and you can see it next year in some of the things that are being published next year, of very personal stories. It's about recipes from my kitchen and bringing out not just the food, but the culture. And with the diet myth, there's been quite a few books, I guess since Fast Food Nation was published in the early 2000s, 1 or 2 a year, which kind of really captures people's attention about how we're eating, what we're doing in the food chain. And those books kind of feed into, I think, what goes on next in the trend for cookery books. For better or for worse, I think some of what the clean eating is about is people have been reading about how they need to get away from processed foods.
I feel there's also something we've missed out in the whole cookbook market, that it seems to me increasingly polarised. Yes, there are these health books, but on the other side are books that are just going after comfort and indulgence as never before. Baking is such a huge trend year on year, partly because of the Great British Bake Off. And I find it fascinating that it's as if there are two separate worlds of food now. And I mean, some of the baking books are lovely. I thought the Honey & Co. baking book this year, I've been baking out of it non-stop, things like their carrot breads and courgette breads, and that makes them sound healthy, but they're not, because they're stuffed full of sugar, but they're absolutely delicious. And they're the antithesis of the clean eating, no gluten.
And a paradox, because under the Christmas tree you're going to find gluten-free books beside Great British Bake Off spin-off books and a little line. And another book which I liked, which is both a campaigning book and a good recipe book, is Hugh Fanny Whittingstall's Leftovers book, which bounces off his TV campaign against waste. It's got a great recipe for fried mackerel skeleton, which I can't wait to try.
And another book which I hugely admired was The Oxford Companion to Sugar and Sweets. It's a reference book on all things sugary, which doesn't make it sound as appealing as it is, but it's just one of those books. I've been reading it on the London Underground a few times and nearly missed my stop. It's that gripping. It's 600 essays on everything from childhood nostalgia sweets to the cakes of Vienna to sugar addiction and slavery.
Well, one book that's hard to ignore this year is that thumping great Bible I mentioned at the beginning of the programme, £6 if it's an ounce, and every ounce of it's admired by food writer Tim Hayward. For him, it is the book of 2015.
A 767-page hardback, beautiful photos, hundreds of recipes, history, background, all put together by a 31-year-old chef.
My name is Magnus Nilsson, and I've just finished writing a book about the culture of eating and cooking in the Nordic region.
The Nordic Cookbook is a work with vast ambition that aims to cover a truly vast area.
Scandinavia is Norway, Denmark and Sweden, and nothing else. The Nordic region is Scandinavia plus Finland, Åland, the Faroe Islands, Iceland and Greenland.
To make a book like this takes an almost Herculean effort.
Collecting recipes is very easy today. You can just go online or you can buy previously published works. So that would have been very, very easy, but that would have been a book without context, just a collection of recipes. So I spent about 3 years traveling around the Nordic region, really trying to understand mainly why people do what they do.
To have made time for this project is a feat in itself. Magnus's day job is heading up Faviken, a restaurant in northern Sweden that's widely thought of as one of the very best. I met Magnus recently in London, bag weighed down by his brick-like tome. And there's a lovely line where you're looking at a bloke who you describe as looking like an angry hippopotamus. And he comes out with one grilled lamprey already on the way down his throat, first half eaten, the other half hanging at the corner of his mouth like a shiny, unlit fish cigar. You've chosen to deliver this, not in the sense of this is something you might have in a restaurant with a little bit of music playing in the background and a guy in a white coat bring it to you, but a fat guy who's having an argument with his wife on a mobile phone. What is a lamprey? And how do you eat them?
So the lamprey, it's not a fish, it's something called a round mouth. And it's a kind of a semi-parasitic, scavenging little creature that lives in rivers.
You're selling it to me.
I am, right?
Really getting into this.
You have them in the UK as well. Because it's not a bony fish, they don't have any bones, they're just cartilage. So quite often they're grilled or smoked and stuff like that. And you eat the whole thing. From one end to another, like a sausage, You don't gut them, you don't take out the bones or the cartilage. For me, it's I really tried to keep the recipe content and the methods unbiased, so I haven't changed them anything. They're really exactly as they were collected. But I tried to sometimes include little stories like this to really explain them as a cultural occurrence, basically. And this whole thing has happened in a parking lot next to a highway in Finland, and I was just kind of a spectator.
Alongside some of the more colourful stuff you might expect, the festering shark, the whale meat, the puffins, there are also 6 different regional recipes for split pea soup. And it's this detail and the thought over the question of what is authentic and what stays in that for me makes this book outstanding.
I think there are about 50 recipes in the book that no one will ever cook from, simply because they can't get the produce or they're not appealing or so on. But they're still important to include because they explain something about the cultural context. And then you have another 680 recipes that are used by a majority of Nordics or Scandinavians throughout their week. If those people can cook them up there during their sort of everyday life, I'm fairly certain that people in the rest of the world will be able to do so as well.
It goes from the absolutely everyday, how to boil carrots, right the way through to the stuff you will never in a million years be able to... Your publisher must hate you. You can't take a single recipe out of this because it paints the broadest possible canvas.
And the book has gone up in volume, which all of the people working with foreign editions are unhappy about in that sense, because it was only predicted to be half the amount of words, 150,000, and it ended up being 260,000 because it was just so much that we couldn't leave out. It's been very challenging, but it has to be like that because otherwise you can't call it, a document of a food culture.
Magnus Nilsson talking about his book, The Nordic Cookbook, to Tim Hayward. Alex, what do you make of it?
It's monumental, literally. I mean, as a Scot living in Scotland, I find it very exciting. You know, we're trying to recover our own indigenous food culture, which has been subject of much mockery. And the Nords have managed to do it. We're just next door. I mean, I was opening the Best Scots cookbook I know, and it has just 5 recipes for herring. Magnus has 47. But there are things that are really quite bizarre and hilarious in it. I mean, I think it's the first cookbook since the anarchist cookbook that could actually get you put into prison for doing some of the recipes. Puffins stuffed with cake and roasted fulmar chicks.
I see him as a kind of Claudia Roden-like figure. He's just so interested in these subtle variations of how people actually make things in ordinary homes. People keep talking about Nordic cooking being the future, and if so, it tastes rather like the 1950s in the most delightful way. He sent me back to doing things like broccoli gratin coated in bechamel, lovely cheesy bechamel enriched with an egg yolk. I would never have thought to make that. It's the sort of thing my mum might have made in the 1980s or 70s, and it's delicious. And his potato pancakes, many variants, are just homely and down to earth. And I like the way he's trying to document a whole culture. The ambition of it is extraordinary, but I usually get really angry with these big cookbooks which are too big to read in bed and you don't know how to sort of open them on the countertop. And for once I felt it was worth it.
I mean, my husband took a picture of me trying to read that lying down on the sofa last night. You know,
it's not very comfortable.
Good workout.
It wasn't
Crack
very
your
comfortable.
ribs.
No. Tom, to the outsider, how can anybody make money on something like this? It really does weigh a ton. It must have cost a fortune.
This is a book that will sell around the world for Phaidon, and it will probably keep going on in other parts of the world. And also, one of the big things about cookery books is that they, as we say in the business, backlist. So a lot of the books that sell well, continue to sell well, even in the top 100 this year, are books that were published 3, 4, 5 years ago.
There is a backlash going on against Nordic. I mean, you know, people quite rightly say, you know, it's often about being lectured by bearded men in leather aprons who are thumping an earthen table and telling you what you've got to eat. But this is a book full of joy and humour and fun. I love this brilliant description he has of a Helsinki pastry shop with the smell of cinnamon and braising meats and cooking cabbage and sweat from Karelian ladies working heavy rye-based doughs. Lovely pictures.
He doesn't take himself too seriously, does he?
No, he sounds like a person you would like to spend some time with. What makes a food book a classic?
I've often done food book roundups at the end of the year for various newspapers, and I always have this stab of guilt about 6 months later when I realise that one of the books that wasn't on the list is actually fabulous and I start cooking from it. And I feel we review cookbooks far too soon. We should wait 2 years after they come out and see whether they're actually still there on the kitchen shelf, because that's the real test.
B, you wrote, recipes can feel like charms against life's disappointments or protection against the onward march of the years. Underneath it all, is that what our obsession with food and cookbooks is all about?
I think maybe it is. I think consolation is maybe the thing we still look for in cookbooks, and people are trying to get control of their lives, and one of the ways is through food. And this attempt to control takes more and less sympathetic forms. There's the clean eating form, but then there's also just that feeling of going in the kitchen and you've had a hard day and you open a book and it's like a friend.
When Margaret Patton died this year, a lot of people from the 1950s and 60s wrote about how her books, you know, when they lost her, they lost a friend, and the book was still there, sticky paged on the shelf.
Alex Renton, B. Wilson, Tom Tivernan, thank you all very much. Now let's join Dan Saladino for the next instalment of the Ark of Taste, the catalogue of endangered foods.
And we're continuing the book theme because when the slow food movement set out to research the UK's food traditions at risk of extinction to add them to the Ark of Taste, they turned to one text in particular, The Taste of Britain, written by Laura Mason in the 1990s, a painstaking attempt to list our disappearing foods.
It was old-fashioned slogging off to the library, sometimes newspaper archives, trying to find producers at home at a time when they weren't too busy to talk. If you want to talk to a baker, you quite often have to do it at 6 o'clock in the morning when they've just come off a night's baking shift.
And among the 1,000 or so foods she compiled, including breads and biscuits, fruits and meats, on page 9 of The Taste of Britain was a cheese that had been lost and then revived, a cheese now prized by cheesemongers.
It's got almost fudge-like consistency, this one. And it can vary because the younger Vinny can be quite crumbly.
How different is it to a Stilton?
It tastes creamier, perhaps a little bit sharper, but the final taste tends not to be quite so bitter as a Stilton sometimes can be.
Dorset Blue Vinny is one of Britain's true food mysteries, a cheese that by the 1970s was more the stuff of legend than larders. Derek Cooper, the founding presenter of the food programme, once set out on a mission to find it in Dorset, and in 1974 thought he'd succeeded.
Well, I'm told this is Dorset Blue Vinny. It's very difficult to find, but this is the traditional Blue Vinny.
Absolutely.
Which has been made in Dorset
for
many centuries.
The truth, however, turned out to be more bizarre and baffling.
Whereabouts do you get hold of this? Because I've been around Dorset for several days and I haven't found any.
Well, I'd like to be able to tell you. As far as I know, I get it from the chief mechanic of the RDC.
What Derek was being offered in the mid-70s wasn't Dorset Blue Vinny, but surplus Stilton, brought into the county and relabelled. It would take another decade and the work of farmer Mike Davies to bring Vinny back.
Blue Vinny at that point in Dorset was no more.
Being buried, no. Of course, it was banned during the last war because of all the softer type of blue cheeses or semi-hard cheese was banned because they wanted it all made into hard cheese, i.e. cheddars, for easier transportation to the big cities to keep the rations to feed people. That was really the death of the Blue Vinny.
In Laura Mason's Taste of Britain, Vinny's described as a blue mould, hard, skimmed cow's milk cheese, and in terms of flavour, it was strong and sharp. Traditionally, it was made with great skill by the wives of local dairymen.
It was difficult. Although I had the original recipe, it was not an easy cheese to make.
Where did the recipe come from?
The Ministry of Agriculture in Dorchester. The one thing about the Blue Vinny makes it unique from really any other cheese in the whole world, definitely in this country, is it's a hand-skimmed milk cheese. And that is exactly what we've adhered to right the way through the rebirth of the Dorset Blue Vinny.
Because of Mike's work, it's now back in Dorset and taking pride of place in shops, including the Town Mill Cheesemongers in Lyme Regis.
It's one of our best-selling cheeses.
How important is it that that cheese is now sitting on your shelf?
Oh, vital to me. We couldn't be a cheese shop in Dorset without having Dorset Blue Vinny.
Cheesemonger Justin Tunstall, but the last word, which is also a literary one, goes to Justin's apprentice, Harry Ford.
It's mentioned by kind of Dorset poets. William Barnes, there's a big statue of him in Dorchester, and he was a kind of poet who wrote in Dorset dialect, and he talks about Vinny cheese.
If you in Dorset be a Roman and have business at a farm, then won't he see your ale a foaming or your cider down to warm? Won't he have brown bread a putty and some Vinny cheese a cut ye? Butter rolls out, cream why balls out.
Vinny's from an old Anglo-Saxon word. A lot of Dorset dialect go back to the Anglo-Saxon, and it means a mouldy cheese, a veiny cheese, and often it comes in, it's got this wreath of blue around it still today. And a cheese like Vinny has a kind of mythical quality, and I think in a way that's because it came back from the dead, and it rose again, and it's sort of resurrected.
Harry Ford on the cheese that came back from the dead.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more food programmes, there's a treasure trove of them going back to 2007 on the Food Programme website.